Elizabeth Taylor discovered hidden microphones in every room of her house. Someone had been recording her most private conversations for years. When she found out who was listening, it destroyed her. The discovery happened by pure accident on a humid August morning in 1978. Elizabeth Taylor's housekeeper, Maria Gonzalez, was dusting the antique lamp in Elizabeth's bedroom when she knocked it over. As the lamp crashed to the marble floor, its base cracked open, revealing something that shouldn't have been there, a small electronic device with wires leading into the wall. Maria stared at the strange object, not understanding what she was looking at. But Elizabeth, who had just returned from her morning swim, knew immediately what it was. A recording device. Someone had been listening to her most private moments, her intimate conversations, her vulnerable confessions in what she thought was the safety of her own bedroom. Elizabeth's hands were trembling as she picked up the tiny microphone. It was sophisticated, expensive, and clearly installed by a professional. This wasn't some amateur stalker or curious fan, this was systematic surveillance by someone with resources, expertise, and a very specific agenda. But this was only the beginning of a discovery that would reveal the true extent of the violation Elizabeth had been living with for years without knowing it. Over the next 3 hours, Elizabeth and her head of security, Tom Bradley, conducted a methodical sweep of her entire Bel Air mansion. What they found defied belief and shattered every assumption Elizabeth had about privacy and safety in her own home. Every single room contained hidden recording devices. Some concealed in lamps, others behind picture frames, several built directly into the walls themselves during what Elizabeth now realized had been a carefully orchestrated renovation project 2 years earlier. The dining room where Elizabeth hosted intimate dinner parties with Hollywood's elite, sharing gossip and business secrets she thought were safe among friends. The living room where she had cried for hours over her divorce from Richard Burton, pouring out her heart to close confidants. Her private office where she conducted sensitive business calls about her most confidential financial matters and investment strategies. Even her bathroom contained surveillance equipment, the room where she had made desperate late-night phone calls to doctors and therapists during her darkest periods of addiction and depression, believing she was speaking in complete privacy about her most shameful struggles. Someone had been listening to absolutely everything for at least 2 years, possibly much longer, documenting every aspect of Elizabeth Taylor's private existence. But the most chilling discovery came when Tom Bradley traced the intricate wiring system from the hidden microphones throughout the house. The cables didn't just record Elizabeth's conversations for later retrieval. They transmitted them in real time to a sophisticated receiver located in a house just 3 blocks away in the same exclusive neighborhood. Someone had been listening to Elizabeth Taylor's life as it happened, monitoring her every word as she spoke it, cataloging her secrets in real time, documenting her vulnerabilities and weaknesses as they were revealed in her most unguarded moments. Elizabeth felt physically sick as the implications became clear. Every private conversation over the past 2 years, every vulnerable moment when she thought she was safe, every confession she believed she had made in the sanctuary of her own home had been heard by unknown ears. Her business negotiations with studio executives, her intimate conversations with lovers, her medical consultations with doctors, her emotional breakdowns with family members. All of it had been stolen from her and transmitted to strangers who were using her private information for purposes she couldn't even begin to imagine. But who was responsible for this elaborate violation of her privacy? And why had they gone to such sophisticated lengths to monitor Hollywood's most famous actress? The answer would prove to be more shocking and devastating than Elizabeth could have ever anticipated, revealing a conspiracy that reached deep into Hollywood's power structure. Tom Bradley's investigation led him to a nondescript ranch house in Beverly Hills registered under a shell company called Pacific Audio Services. The house appeared completely empty from the outside, with drawn curtains and no signs of occupancy, but sophisticated surveillance equipment was visible through gaps in the window coverings. This wasn't just someone spying on Elizabeth Taylor out of personal obsession. This was a professional intelligence operation with multiple targets, significant financial backing, and connections to powerful interests in the entertainment industry. When Bradley contacted the FBI about the illegal surveillance operation he had uncovered, federal agents informed him of something that made Elizabeth's blood run cold with fear and revulsion. The Pacific Audio Services house was already under federal investigation as part of a larger probe into corporate espionage and celebrity blackmail operations that had been running for years. Elizabeth wasn't the only victim, she was just one target in a systematic campaign to gather compromising information about Hollywood's most powerful and wealthy figures. The surveillance network had been monitoring dozens of celebrities, politicians, and business leaders, creating detailed psychological profiles that were being sold to the highest bidders in a black market for personal intelligence. The recording operation targeting Elizabeth had been financed by a consortium of business interests who saw her personal information as valuable commodity to be exploited for profit. Her investment decisions could be used by competitors to undermine her business ventures. Her private business partnerships could be sabotaged before they were even announced publicly. Her romantic relationships could be manipulated to create scandals that would damage her reputation and market value. Her health struggles, documented through recorded conversations with doctors and therapists, were being sold to tabloid magazines and used to create negative publicity campaigns designed to weaken her negotiating position with studios and producers. But the most devastating betrayal was still to come, a revelation that would destroy Elizabeth's ability to trust anyone in her inner circle ever again. FBI wiretaps of the Pacific Audio Services operation revealed that the surveillance of Elizabeth's home hadn't been initiated by strangers or outside enemies. Someone in Elizabeth's inner circle, someone she trusted completely and considered almost like family, had provided the access and information necessary to install the recording devices during the 1976 renovation of her house. The federal investigation revealed that Elizabeth's own interior designer, Charles Whitman, had been paid $500,000 to allow installation of surveillance equipment during what Elizabeth believed was a simple redecorating project to refresh her home's appearance. Whitman had personally supervised the placement of hidden microphones in every room, ensured that the sophisticated wiring was concealed within the walls during construction, and provided detailed architectural floor plans that allowed the surveillance team to monitor Elizabeth's movements throughout her house and predict where she would have her most private conversations. Elizabeth had trusted Whitman with the most intimate details of her living space, allowing him unlimited access to her home for months while the renovation progressed. She had shared personal information about her daily routines, her security concerns, her need for privacy and emotional sanctuary. She had considered him a close friend, someone who understood her vulnerabilities and respected her need for discretion and confidentiality. Instead, he had been systematically violating her trust for money, turning her own home renovation into an opportunity to destroy her privacy and security. But Whitman wasn't acting alone in his betrayal of Elizabeth's trust. The FBI investigation revealed that he was part of an extensive network of service providers, contractors, household staff, security personnel, personal assistants, who had been recruited and paid by the surveillance operation to provide access to celebrity homes and private information. Elizabeth's violation was part of a larger conspiracy that had been targeting Hollywood figures for years, using their trust in service providers to gain access to their most private spaces and conversations. The recorded conversations from Elizabeth's house revealed the staggering scope of what had been stolen from her over 2 years of constant surveillance. Business discussions about her film contracts that gave competitors advanced knowledge of her negotiation strategies and allowed them to undermine her deals. Personal conversations about her health conditions that were sold to tabloid magazines for sensationalized stories about her medical struggles. Intimate details about her relationships with Richard Burton, Rock Hudson, and other famous figures that were used to create blackmail material and manipulate her romantic partnerships. Private financial discussions that allowed business competitors to sabotage her investment opportunities and undermine her wealth-building strategies. But perhaps most damaging were the recordings of Elizabeth's private therapy sessions, which she had conducted by phone from her home office during her struggles with prescription drug addiction and depression. Her deepest fears about her career, her childhood traumas from being a child star, her suicidal thoughts during her darkest periods, her desperate attempts to maintain her sanity in the face of constant public scrutiny, all of it had been documented and sold to people who used her psychological vulnerabilities against her. The surveillance operation had recorded over 3,000 hours of Elizabeth's private conversations over 2 years, creating a comprehensive psychological profile that was being used to manipulate and control every aspect of her life. Every business decision she made, every personal relationship she pursued, every moment of weakness or vulnerability had been catalogued and weaponized by people who saw her humanity as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited for profit. Elizabeth began to realize with growing horror that many of the problems she had experienced over the past 2 years, the mysteriously failed business deals, the relationship difficulties that seemed to come out of nowhere, the health issues that seemed to worsen despite expensive treatment, could be traced directly back to information that had been stolen from her home through the surveillance operation. People had been using her own words against her, manipulating her life with knowledge they had obtained through systematic violation of her privacy and trust. They had turned her most private thoughts and feelings into weapons to be used in destroying her happiness and success. The investigation revealed that recordings of Elizabeth's conversations had been sold to business competitors who used the inside information to undermine her investment opportunities and sabotage potential film projects before Elizabeth even knew they were being targeted. Her private discussions about potential roles, business partnerships, and financial strategies had been shared with rival studios and competing actresses, allowing them to destroy deals and opportunities that should have been hers. Personal recordings of her conversations with friends and family members had been used to create targeted harassment and manipulation campaigns designed to isolate Elizabeth and make her more dependent on the very people who were exploiting her. The surveillance network hadn't just been stealing her privacy, they had been actively working to destroy her relationships and undermine her mental health. But the cruelest aspect of the surveillance operation was how it had been used to enable and worsen her prescription drug dependency. Recordings of Elizabeth's conversations with doctors revealed her desperate attempts to manage chronic pain and emotional trauma through medication. This sensitive medical information had been shared with unscrupulous physicians who had deliberately overprescribed dangerous medications, knowing that her growing addiction would make her more vulnerable to manipulation and control. The people listening to Elizabeth's most private moments hadn't just been passive observers documenting her life, they had been actively orchestrating events and relationships in her life to create more opportunities for exploitation and control. They had turned her own home into an elaborate trap where every word she spoke was being used to tighten psychological chains around her. The surveillance network had even infiltrated Elizabeth's medical care, using recorded conversations about her health concerns to manipulate her treatment plans and medication regimens. Doctors who were part of the conspiracy had been adjusting her prescriptions based not on medical need, but on the surveillance team's desire to keep her chemically dependent and psychologically unstable. When Elizabeth called her physicians late at night, crying about pain or depression, the surveillance team was listening and analyzing her emotional state to determine how to exploit her vulnerabilities further. They had turned her medical care into another weapon against her mental health and independence. The recordings also revealed how the surveillance network had been manipulating Elizabeth's business relationships by sharing her private conversations with competing studios and agents. When Elizabeth discussed potential film projects or business ventures in what she believed was the privacy of her home, that information was being sold to her competitors, allowing them to sabotage deals before she even knew they were under threat. Her private expressions of doubt about certain business partners or concerns about specific contracts were being used to create conflicts and misunderstandings that damaged her professional relationships and cost her millions of dollars in lost opportunities. When Elizabeth learned the full extent of how the surveillance had been used against her, she experienced what she would later describe as a complete psychological breakdown that lasted for months. The realization that her own home had been compromised for years, that people had been profiting from her pain and vulnerability, that her most trusted relationships had been infiltrated by people working systematically against her interests, it was more than her mind could process or accept. For weeks after the discovery, Elizabeth couldn't bear to be alone in her house. Every room felt contaminated by the knowledge that strangers had been listening to her most intimate and vulnerable moments for years. She had the entire mansion rebuilt from the ground up, but even complete reconstruction couldn't restore her fundamental sense of safety, privacy, and trust. The legal aftermath of the surveillance discovery revealed the stunning scope of the criminal operation. Federal prosecutors eventually charged 23 people in connection with the celebrity surveillance network, including Charles Whitman and several other service providers who had facilitated access to celebrity homes across Los Angeles. Elizabeth Taylor had survived public scandals, failed marriages, near-death experiences, and decades of brutal media scrutiny. But the discovery that her own home had been turned into a surveillance facility, that people had been profiting from her most vulnerable moments, broke something inside her that never fully healed. The woman who had always been able to retreat to the privacy of her own home for refuge and emotional recovery learned that even that sanctuary had been an elaborate illusion. For years, she had been unknowingly performing her private life for an audience of strangers who saw her pain as entertainment and her vulnerability as business opportunity.